Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stories for the Family. I'm Shannon Thompson. I am the Story Center Program Manager, and I'm here to welcome to you today. Today, we have Joyce Slater telling stories. She tells the stories she loves, whether they are fairy tales, folk tales, ghost stories, or true tales about her life in Kansas City. She learned how to tell stories from her grandmother and her father. She has been a professional storyteller for 25 years. She is a member of River and Prairie Storyweavers and the president of Motel, a storytelling guild in Missouri. All right, Joyce, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Shannon. I'm really excited to be here. I love the MCPL libraries and especially the Story Center. And I remember when it opened and hoped then I would be telling stories there, and I have been. Today, I want to tell you a couple of fairy tales. I love fairy tales. I just always loved fairy tales. My grandmother told me fairy tales. She also taught us all the nursery rhymes. So all my sisters and my brother, we could recite them by rote by the time we were 3 years old. But these two stories, the first two stories I'm going to tell you, are from Scandinavian countries, and I am Swedish and German. My dad was Swedish. I went to Sweden with him one time, and I had told this story before, this first story. I had told it before, but when I went to Sweden, suddenly this story really came alive because I was in the forest. I was seeing the Silver Lakes. I was imagining the hunter coming through the woods. The story is called The Dragon Slayer. Once upon a time, there was a woodsman. He was tasked with raising a baby boy because the mother died in childbirth. Now, he didn't know a thing about raising a child, but he used all of his skills to figure out how he could train a son. He taught him everything from the time he was a little boy, and he carried that boy everywhere when he was a baby. He taught him all things, even sewing and cooking. So that boy knew a lot to go out into the world. When he was 20 years old, he went to his father and he said, "Father, I am ready to go out into the world and have an adventure." Well, this was a sad day for his father because they were very close. They spoke all the time. They were best friends, but he knew it was something that should happen. So he helped his son prepare his journey. He made him a new bow and 3 new arrows in a new quiver. He gave him a nice sharp knife and a rucksack full of dried fruits and vegetables, meats, and cheeses of all kinds. Now, when the day finally came that the boy would leave, it was sad for both of them, but they hugged, knowing that they would probably never see each other again. The boy journeyed out into the world. He became a great hunter. And you can always tell a great hunter by the clothes they wear. He journeyed far and wide, but one day he found himself in a forest. As he was walking through the forest, he was growing tired and hungry, and he decided it was time to stop for the night. So he built a fire, and he took out the fresh meat that he had, and he cooked it. He was ready to eat when suddenly, in the forest, he saw a wolf. Now he reached for his bow and his arrow, and he aimed at that wolf. And before he could release the arrow, the wolf spoke and said, "You don't want to hurt me. I want to be your friend. You never know when you might need a friend like me someday. Well, the hunter was a little leery about a talking wolf, but he asked him to join him for dinner, and they ate and they talked. And finally, they grew tired and fell asleep. And when he woke up the next day, well, he was still alive. So he trusted the wolf. Now they journeyed on through the forest. And again they stopped. They built a fire. They prepared a meal. And they were talking when the hunter saw coming through the woods a bear. Now again he drew his bow and arrow and aimed at that bear. But the bear stopped him and said, "You don't want to hurt me. I want to be your friend. You never know when you might need a friend like me someday." And sure enough, they all three became friends. Now they journeyed the next day through the woods, and they stopped again at night. And this time they talked so long they weren't paying attention when the lion came through the woods. Now, I know what you're thinking, but this is a fairy tale. The lion came through the woods, and they didn't even have time to grab the bow and the arrow. But the lion said, "You don't want to harm me. I want to be your friend. You never know when you might need a friend like me someday." Well, sure enough, the three animals and the hunter, they became close friends, and they walked all the way through the woods together, and finally they came to a clearing. And when they came into the clearing, there was a castle, and that castle was covered in black cloth. There was black cloth hanging from the windows. There was even a parade coming from the castle, all draped in black. It was led by a coach, a black coach, with 4 black horses leading it. Now, the hunter was afraid that all these people coming might be afraid of his friends, so he told them to stay in the woods. He met a man on the road, and he said, "What is this? What's happening? Did someone die?" And they said, "Oh, no. You see, there is a dragon that lives in a great silver lake just beyond those trees. And every month he requires that we send one of our people to him. And this month he requested the princess. We all love the princess so much, but we know we'll never see her again." Well, the hunter thought, "Oh, surely you have hunters. Surely you have someone who could slay a dragon." He went along the parade, and he asked people, "Why haven't you sent your knights? Why haven't you sent someone to kill this dragon?" And they said, "Oh, we have, but no one ever returns." And then he came to the coach, and out of the coach stepped this beautiful woman. Now, I have to say, he was taken with this princess. She was beautiful. But when she stepped out, she said, "Who are you?" He said, "Well, you don't know me, but I'm the dragon slayer." He wanted to impress her. She said, "The dragon slayer? Then you could take care of this, and I could live." Now, truth be told, the hunter had never killed a dragon in his life, and he wasn't sure he could do it now. But she led him through the trees to the silver lake and said, "This is where he lives." Now, there was no dragon there, And he was admiring the beauty of this woman and thinking, oh, if I wasn't on an adventure, I would stay around here. When suddenly a 12-headed dragon came up from the lake, all 12 ugly heads breathing fire behind him. She nearly fainted. He turned around to see all of these heads. He drew his arrow and fixed his bow and shot at one of the heads, but the arrow bounced off. He drew another and shot another arrow at another head, but again it bounced off, and he thought, this dragon will kill us both. When suddenly he remembered he had 3 friends. He called for his friends from the forest, and they each came and jumped on one of the heads and reared back that dragon until his soft belly was exposed. And then the hunter took his bow and an arrow and shot straight into the heart of that dragon. The dragon fell forward onto the shore of that lake, all 12 heads laying there before him. Now he knew he needed proof of the kill. He always had proof of his kill. And what could he carry? So he removed those tongues and put them in his rucksack. Now he turned to the princess, and she was beaming, and she said, oh, now do you know what this means? You get to marry me, and you get half of my father's kingdom. Now the hunter was a bit perplexed because he wasn't really ready to get married. He said, I'm not really ready for marriage. I'm on an adventure and I need to finish that. And she began to cry, and you know, it just touched him. So he said, in a year and a day, I will return and we will marry. So she said, I will hold you to that promise. She took off her ring and she gave it to him and said, carry this with you. And when you return, send it to me. And so he put it on his little finger, and he and his 3 friends were off. Now, the coachman had been watching all along. He was not young and handsome, but he was smart. He came around and he removed all 12 heads of that dragon. And he said to the princess, I will take these to the king. These are my proof that I slew the dragon. No matter what she said or did, there was nothing she could change. Who would her father believe if he had the heads? And so it was. But she said to her father, I have had such a horrible day, Father. Can I not wait a year and a day before I get married? And so he agreed. Well, a year and a day went by pretty quickly, and that hunter had been thinking a lot about her. And he came back ready to get married. When he came, the castle was covered in color. Every window a different shade. And people were celebrating. He could hear music. So he met another person on the path, and he said, what's going on? And they said, well, the princess is getting married today. And he said, but how did she know? How did she know for sure I would return? He said, well, she's marrying the coachman. He said, quickly, run as fast as you can. Take this ring to the princess. And the man did. Now he followed with his friends, and they came to the castle, and he went to the king, and he said, I have come to marry the princess. And the king said, well, she is marrying the coachman. And the coachman came in, and he laid those 12 shriveled heads on the floor and said, this is why I get to marry the princess. I killed the dragon. But the hunter always kept proof of his kill, and he fitted each of those heads with a tongue from his rucksack. And the king knew who was the liar. He banished that coachman from the country, and the hunter and the princess married. And you know, they had a great celebration. It lasted days, and it was unusual because the hunter had three best men: the wolf, the bear, and the lion. And that is the story of the Dragon Slayer. I hope you enjoyed that one. I love fairy tales. My grandmother would tell us nursery rhymes, which, you know, it's amazing. Some of them were very meaningful. Some I could just spout off. I had no idea what they meant. You know, like Jack Sprat could eat no fat, his wife could eat no lean, and so betwixt them both, you see, they lick the platter clean. Well, my next story is also from Scandinavia, and I just love this story. You should always tell stories you love because you will tell them best. This story is called The Mouse Princess. Once upon a time, there was a king. He was getting old, and he knew that he would have to find a replacement. Now, he had 3 sons, no daughters, so he figured one of his sons would be king. He went to his wife with this problem, and she agreed, yes, we are getting old. He went to her because she was always trusted. Her advice was always the best. She said, what will you do? Will you give them a test? I mean, we do have 3 sons, and they could each be eligible. He said, I don't know. Do you have any ideas? She said, well, not offhand, but let me think about it. And he said at that moment, you know, you have always been my best advisor. You have always given me the wisest advice. And you know, I look at our sons, and not a one of them has a partner like you. Not a one of them has any partner at all. I think before they can become king, they must have a partner, because this is certainly a 2-person job. So she said, well, let's bring them together. So they gathered the 3 sons together. The king told him, I'm getting old, and now I'm looking for a replacement for myself. And I'm looking to you, my 3 sons. Which one of you will be king? Well, the oldest one, he thought to himself, I'm the oldest. I should be king. Why has he brought the rest of these? He said, none of you have shown any interest in a partner. Not that we know of, anyway. No brides, no partners. What? This job needs cooperation. So he said, so, as the tradition is in our family, as I chose your mother, as my father chose his bride, as his father chose his bride, you will do the same. And that is, you will cut down a tree, and in the direction it falls, you will journey to find your bride. Now, the first son, the oldest son, he already had his sights set on the princess in the adjoining kingdom. He knew exactly how to cut that tree to head in that direction. And the second son, why, he had been seeing a farm girl who lived on one of the farms in their own kingdom, and he knew how to cut a tree to go in that direction too. But the third son, he was a dreamer. He had no idea how to cut a tree down. He would sit under trees and dream and write poetry and think of the stars, but he never cut a tree down. So when he cut his, it headed toward the forest. The oldest boy laughed. What are you going to marry, a fox? A deer? Maybe a bear. But the boy thought, oh, well, life brings you such wonders. I'll just follow my nose into the forest. And that's what he did. He looked around. He had the best time looking at trees and leaves and the underground foliage and eating nuts and berries along the way. He didn't realize it was getting close to dark. He still hadn't seen a human being when he saw a cabin in the woods. So he went up to the cabin and he knocked on the door, but no one answered. So he went on in, and it was clear nobody lived there. The hearth was cold. It was dirty, and, well, the table was overturned. There were a few broken chairs. He managed to secure one chair, and he upturned the table. He dusted things off, and he sat down, and he ate the little bit of food he brought. He was looking around the room when from the corner scurried a mouse, a tiny gray mouse. And he said, well, there is life in here after all. Hello, little mouse. And to his surprise, the mouse said, hello. And why are you here? He said, I've never met a talking mouse. Well, I'm here because my father has sent me on a journey to find a bride, a partner, so that I may become king, perhaps. She said, well, you could marry me. He said, you're a mouse. Yes, but you could marry me. Again, you're a mouse. I'm sorry, but I don't think that would work. She said, well, I imagine you're very tired. And she gave him something to drink, and he went sound asleep. The next morning he woke up, and she said, you can tell your father you have found a partner. He picked her up and he petted her, and she was so soft. Her eyes sparkled, but she was still a mouse. He journeyed home, and sure enough, they all told of their adventures. The father was really surprised to see them all so soon. He thought it might take even a year to find someone. But there they were. The oldest talked of the princess. The second one talked of the farm girl. And when they turned to the youngest, he said, she is sweet of nature. She has sparkling eyes, and she wears a gray velvet gown. Well, they were startled. Now, the father said, well, they've all found someone, and the queen said they have all found someone. So are these women practical? They'll have to run a household. They'll have to make decisions. They'll have to know what is good in the kitchen, too. Can they bake bread? Well, that was the task set before them. So each of the boys went back to the women, and they said, you need to bake a loaf of bread. Well, when the youngest went to the mouse, he said, I know this is going to be very difficult. You have to bake a loaf of bread. She said, a loaf of bread. All right. I know you're hungry and thirsty. She gave him something to eat and something to drink, and sure enough, he ate, and then he fell sound asleep again. And when he was asleep, she called 1,000 mice together and told them to go out and into the fields beyond the forest and gather bits of grain. And they did. They ground it, and eventually they made it into a tiny loaf of bread. The next morning when he woke, she handed him a nut. He said, a nut? What am I going to do with this nut? Give it to your father. Off he went. And sure enough, the three arrived. They each had something. The first one had a loaf of bread that the king said it didn't have much flavor, but it was a loaf of bread. The second one was very tasty, a little coarse, but it was tasty. And when the third one handed the nut, he said, what is this? He opened it, and there was a tiny loaf of bread. He put it in his mouth, and it was the most delicious bread he had ever tasted. He said, my goodness, this is wonderful. But the other two said, oh, surely we can't depend on your choice based on a loaf of bread. So the queen said, well, she'll have to know how to run a kingdom, and everybody will need clothes, and she'll have to know how to get people to make clothes, and she'll have to judge that. So she should be able to spin and weave. So off they went with the task of bringing back a piece of cloth woven by their intended. Well, they all left, and the youngest went to the mouse. He was growing quite fond of her now. And he told her, well, as soon as he walked in, she said, are we going to get married? And he said, no, I don't know how they'll take a mouse anyway, but no, you have to weave some cloth. Well, she gave him something to eat and something to drink, and sure enough, he went to sleep. She called those 1,000 mice again, and they went out into the fields, and they gathered cotton and flax, and they spun it, and they wove it into cloth, and she tucked it into a nut. And the next day, he took that nut with him to the king. Well, it was the same thing. The first boy brought cloth that was, it wasn't the greatest, but it was cloth. The second one was lovely, but it was coarse. And there was the third boy. He handed him a nut, and he said, a nut. He opened it up, and out came this cloth that was like gossamer. It was sheer, it was shimmering, and it expanded from that nut. It was so beautiful. The king said, I've never seen anything like this, and the queen agreed. They said, I think it's time for all three of you to marry. Tomorrow we'll have a wedding. The next day they all went to gather their brides. And the third boy, he went to the mouse, and she said, do we get married today? And he said, yes, it will be different. And so she called her 1,000 mice together, and they brought with them a coach for her, and 6 mice pulled the coach. And as they walked through the forest, why, she could barely keep up with the steps of the third boy. But they came to the king, and as they came through the forest, the oldest boy laughed. He said, this is your bride? A mouse? We should have known. And what is this silly contraption she's in? And with that, he kicked that coach as high as he could, and it landed in the river. Now the youngest boy, he was heartbroken. As he turned to face his brother, he heard something behind him, and out from the river came a full coach drawn by horses. And there inside was a beautiful princess dressed in gray velvet. He said, oh my word. She said, the spell is broken. If it hadn't been for your brother kicking us into the water, we would never have changed. But I needed a human being to fall in love with me and another to oppose me. And so all 3 boys were married that day. The oldest became king in another kingdom. The youngest, he never wanted to be king anyway. He went to live with his princess. And the king turned the kingdom over to a wise and practical son, the middle boy, who married the farm girl. And I've heard that they all lived happily ever after. Thank you, everyone, for listening to my stories. I hope that you enjoy fairy tales as much as I do. They are magical. Now, there are a few announcements. First of all, before I forget, there is an evaluation. Just like when you are at the library and you receive that pink form, well, there is an evaluation in the comments. So I hope that you will fill that out, because we are funded by the Kaufman Center, the Kaufman Foundation, for these programs. And the Kaufman Foundation needs to hear from us and needs to know what we're doing with their money. Also, I would like to announce that at the Story Center, there is a story swap on May 21st. Now, go to events for the Story Center and look for Story Swap. I will be guiding that Story Swap, and we may even have some coaching that night. So I hope you can come to that. And I will also have a program for preschoolers and youngsters and families next Thursday. That is May 7th. And then there is a program on May 28th. They're both at 10 o'clock. So look at the MCPL 360 Facebook page for those. I hope you will come back for all the programming at the Story Center and MCPL. They do so many programs. In fact, next Friday, Brother John will be doing a program at 3 o'clock. And the week after that will be Phil Blue Owl Hoosier. So I hope that you enjoyed this program enough that you will come and see more. In this time of strangeness, I hope you are staying well and staying safe. And please, tell your stories. Thank you very much. And I want to thank the Story Center for inviting me to come into your home to tell you stories.